She thought she owned the harbor until she tried to ticket the Navy. The morning had arrived with the gentle promise of sunlight spilling over the horizon, turning the calm harbor into a canvas of gold and silver reflections dancing across the water. I had barely stepped off my Navy patrol boat, the familiar hum of the engine still vibrating faintly under my boots, when the sun hit my eyes with surprising intensity. The crisp smell of sea salt and the faint tang of diesel clung to the air around me, a scent that had become inseparable from homecoming, carrying with it a strange mix of relief and lingering tension. My deployment bag, heavy with clothes that smelled faintly of the ship and months of travel, swung against my side with each step I took across the wooden dock, and my coffee, steaming and aromatic, was still warm enough to remind me that some comforts existed outside of uniformed service. It should have been a quiet morning, the kind where the sea whispered stories to anyone who would listen, the seagulls crying overhead like background music, and the gentle rocking of nearby vessels syncing with my heartbeat, reminding me of the rhythm of life beyond deployment. But the calm ended abruptly, shattered by the sharp click of heels on the wooden planks of the dock, a sound that immediately drew my attention. That's when she appeared. She came into view like a storm in pastel colors, a woman whose presence demanded attention, even before I realized why. The pink blazer she wore was so bright it seemed almost unreal against the muted hues of the harbor, clashing with the soft blues and grays of the early morning. Oversized sunglasses covered half her face, giving her an air of untouchable authority, while her perfectly coiffed hair hinted at hours spent preparing for some personal parade. In one hand she carried a clipboard, the other swinging with the assuredness of someone who believed themselves to be the arbiter of rules and order. Every step she took was measured and confident, heels clicking in a rhythm that matched the beating of my own pulse, and yet somehow it was discordant with the gentle peace of the dock. She moved toward my patrol boat with the precision of a general inspecting her troops, every inch of her posture radiating certainty, conviction, and the unmistakable scent of self-importance. Then, without warning, she reached the side of the vessel and produced a bright sticker from her clipboard, peeling it with an almost ceremonial flourish. My eyes widened as the glossy surface met the pristine hull, the sticker clinging with a resounding slap that seemed louder than it should have been, echoing against the water and the hull as if announcing its own triumph. The words glared at me, $500 violation. Her triumphant smile widened as she stepped back to admire her handiwork, clearly expecting applause for her diligence. She turned toward me, arms crossed, like a judge passing sentence. "This commercial vehicle is not allowed here," she declared, voice sharp and final, every syllable dripping with authority. I blinked. The word commercial had barely left her lips when my brain registered the absurdity of the statement. I stood frozen, coffee warming my hand but suddenly irrelevant, the morning sun now feeling almost hostile against my face. "That's a military patrol boat," I said slowly, my voice catching somewhere between incredulity and irritation. The words felt absurd even as I spoke them, like I was explaining basic physics to someone who had just insisted gravity was optional. My mind raced, remembering deployments, long nights navigating through hostile waters, drills that left every muscle screaming, and the countless hours ensuring this vessel remained operational and ready for service. And now, this woman, clipboard in hand and authority in spades, had slapped a sticker on it like it was an abandoned delivery van. She did not blink, she did not hesitate, she did not reconsider. She folded her arms and leaned slightly back, as if to emphasize her power. "Military people aren't special," she said simply, almost as if she had delivered a proverb rather than a declaration that defied logic. Her tone was casual, dismissive, as though she had just stated a universal truth rather than a blatant misunderstanding of federal property law. The words hit harder than I expected, not because of their insult but because of their audacity. It was a statement meant to provoke, to assert control over a situation she clearly had no right to control. I felt the coffee tremble slightly in my hand, the heat suddenly irrelevant against the surge of disbelief and rising irritation. Around us, the dock continued its morning routine, seemingly oblivious to the confrontation unfolding. Seagulls cried as if in protest, flapping their wings against the pale sky, and a nearby fishing boat creaked gently in the current, mooring ropes groaning under the tug of water. The harbor, usually a sanctuary where the sea and land met in quiet harmony, had become the stage for a battle I hadn't anticipated this early in the day. My hands itched to remove the sticker, to throw it back at her with the force of all the indignation I felt, but decorum, something I clung to despite every instinct screaming, held me back for a moment. I needed to think, to respond without letting frustration turn into chaos. But thinking became harder with every second her smug smile lingered, a smile that implied victory over a fight she had barely even understood. The morning sun reflected off the water into my eyes again, blinding me momentarily as I considered my options. Should I call the base, security, the local authorities, or should I confront her directly and risk a public scene that could spiral into something worse? My mind ran through scenarios with the precision of military planning, each one more absurd than the last, the absurdity heightened by the knowledge that this was not a drill, not a training exercise, and certainly not something I could log in a report with a simple note. No, this was real life, and in real life, someone had just slapped a $500 violation sticker on a federal military vessel and expected compliance. I watched her adjust her sunglasses, tilting her head slightly as if she sensed my hesitation and interpreted it as weakness. Her confidence did not waver. In fact, it seemed to grow with my silent astonishment. The clipboard remained in her hand like a scepter, a symbol of authority she had conjured from nothing but sheer self-assurance. Around us, the harbor had resumed its rhythm, as if mocking the tension between her certainty and my reality. Boats rocked gently, seagulls swooped down to the water, and the morning wind carried the scent of salt, diesel, and something I couldn't quite place, the sharp tang of confrontation. Finally, I set my coffee down on the edge of the dock, ignoring the faint hiss as it met the wet wood, and took a measured breath. My voice came out steadier this time, firmer, carrying the weight of all the training, discipline, and authority I had earned. "Ma'am," I said slowly, letting each word land, "this is federal military property. That sticker, it has no legal standing here." Her eyes, hidden behind dark lenses, did not waver, but her mouth twitched slightly, perhaps at the first sign that she was about to encounter resistance. She tilted her head, clipboard still in hand, as if evaluating whether this argument was worth the energy, then shook it slightly as if dismissing the thought. "Military people aren't special," she repeated, as though saying it twice would somehow reinforce the untruth. The dock remained silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the pilings and the distant hum of engines from vessels preparing for the day. My heart raced, part anger, part disbelief, part that strange adrenaline that comes from the unexpected collision between civilian ignorance and military reality. I bent slightly, reaching for the sticker, ready to remove it before the absurdity escalated further, but paused as her voice cut through the air once again. "Rules are rules," she said, firm, final, as if she had delivered the ultimate truth. Her tone carried a smug authority that seemed unshakable, yet beneath it, I could sense the fragility of someone whose power existed only in perception and not in law or reality. And just like that, my quiet morning ended, not with a bang, not with a clash of metal or a storm of words, but with the simple slap of a sticker and the unshakable belief of someone who had mistaken self-importance for justice. The patrol boat beneath me, my home for months, my vessel of duty and honor, now bore the bright, mocking label of her triumph. I clenched my fists, not knowing if I was angrier at the sticker, at her arrogance, or at the world that allowed such misunderstandings to unfold in such a vivid, humiliating tableau. Yet deep down, beneath the irritation and disbelief, a spark ignited, the spark of determination, the stubborn insistence that rules, reality, and respect were not things to be mocked so lightly, even by someone with a clipboard and oversized sunglasses. The morning sun continued to climb, the harbor shimmered, and I knew this confrontation was only the beginning. It didn't take long for me to learn her name. Corinne Whitmore. She introduced herself to the dock with all the subtlety of a foghorn announcing the arrival of a storm, and from the way she carried herself, it was clear she intended to leave a mark that would not fade easily. Newly elected HOA president of Harbor Point Residences, she had a reputation that preceded her like a cloud of unspoken warnings. Feared by lawn chairs that were never quite aligned, recycling bins that dared to overflow, and any porch light bulb that deviated even slightly from the color spectrum sanctioned by the neighborhood bylaws. Word had it that she once issued a formal complaint against a resident for planting tulips in the wrong shade of pink, and that story alone had become a whispered legend, told in hushed voices by anyone who valued their sense of decorum and the safe invisibility of a compliant life. Residents seemed to treat her like a mythical creature, a kind of civic banshee, whose sharp tongue and unwavering conviction could strike fear into anyone whose life dared to diverge from the imaginary line she had drawn between acceptable and unspeakably wrong. Corinne treated the marina like it was her personal kingdom, and in her mind she was queen, ruler, and ultimate arbitrator of what could exist within her carefully manicured domain. The docks, the boats, the small spaces between pilings, all were part of her kingdom, a place where she could exercise control, declare judgment, and enforce rules as if they had been handed down from Mount Olympus itself. And my patrol boat, the vessel I had navigated through storms, enemy waters, and months of relentless deployment, was to her an affront, a blight on her carefully curated view of order and perfection. To Corinne, it was not just a boat, it was enemy territory, a symbol of chaos intruding upon the sanctity of her harbor. I began to see the lines of her world, drawn not by maps or laws but by a combination of personal preference, ego, and an almost militaristic obsession with control, and I realized that my presence had crossed one of those lines. The morning after the sticker incident, whispers began to ripple through the community. Residents leaned over balcony railings, binoculars in hand, coffee mugs clutched, and smartphones ready, eager to witness what would surely unfold next. Nobody dared challenge Corinne. Nobody ever did. Even the dockhands, who had spent decades navigating the unpredictable moods of the harbor, gave her a wide berth, muttering warnings about getting on the wrong side of Corinne Whitmore, as if it were some timeless, universal truth. Lawn chairs were repositioned, kayaks were realigned, and decorative flags were suddenly subject to intense scrutiny as she patrolled the area in her signature pink blazer, sunglasses perched high, clipboard clutched like a sword of judgment. But I was different. I had come from a world where orders, chains of command, and respect for protocol weren't suggestions. They were lifelines. The sticker she slapped on my patrol boat wasn't just incorrect. It was a flagrant misunderstanding of the rules, a deliberate overreach that I could not ignore. As I observed her from my boat, standing tall with arms crossed and clipboard tucked under her elbow, it became painfully clear that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. Corinne operated on a different frequency entirely, one where self-assigned authority trumped law and perception mattered more than reality. She seemed to radiate power in waves, a force field that had kept the harbor in check for months, and I suddenly understood why nobody challenged her. Residents continued to peek from balconies, whispering with a mixture of fear and fascination. Children leaned against railings, watching with wide eyes, their small hands gripping metal bars, sensing the tension in the air even if they didn't fully understand it. An elderly couple, known for their perfect rose garden and obsession with morning walks, peeked from behind curtains, muttering under their breath about that Corinne, as if speaking her name aloud could summon her wrath. Even the local dog-walking community seemed to pause, leashes slack in mid-step, as if sensing the gravitational pull of her presence. I realized quickly that Corinne didn't need to issue threats to control the marina. Her reputation alone was enough to keep residents in a state of anxious compliance. Yet here I was, freshly returned from deployment, standing in what she clearly considered contested territory, unwilling to bow to her whims. As she paced along the dock, clipboard tapping rhythmically against her hip, I could hear the sharp, practiced cadence of her footsteps, each one punctuating her authority. She stopped occasionally to inspect boats, leaning in with a faint frown at hull lines, questioning whether the paint matched the standards she had imagined, or whether a fender was in the correct position. Her gaze landed on my patrol boat again, sharp and assessing, like a general evaluating the opposing forces on a battlefield. I felt her eyes as if they were weighing my intentions, my presence, my audacity, all at once, and for a moment I wondered if she even understood what she was facing. I was no civilian boat owner. I had spent months at sea under orders, navigating hostile waters, and ensuring that every inch of my vessel was operational, ready, and in compliance with far more serious regulations than anything she could impose with a clipboard. Yet here she was, standing tall in her pink blazer, claiming dominion over my ship with nothing but confidence and community bylaws. It wasn't just the residents watching that added pressure. It was the sense that this was a spectacle, a performance of power. Karen thrived in the public eye, and her interactions with the marina were as much about asserting dominance as they were about enforcing rules. Every nod she gave herself, every small adjustment of her sunglasses, was deliberate, choreographed even, a display meant to remind anyone observing that this was her kingdom, and she alone determined who belonged within it. And now, for the first time in months, someone had dared to cross that invisible boundary, me. The thought sent a thrill of defiance through me, a stubborn pride that refused to be tamed by community standards or the weight of her reputation. I had rules, too, rules rooted in law, in military protocol, in reality, and I wasn't about to let her unilateral authority dictate what could or could not exist in the harbor. I took a deep breath, the salty morning air filling my lungs, and allowed myself a small smile. The whispers of residents continued, a soft murmur that reminded me of the stakes at play. Karen had cultivated fear, yes, but she had also created the illusion that nobody would stand up to her. I was about to shatter that illusion, one careful step at a time. With coffee in hand and deployment bag slung over my shoulder, I moved closer to the dock, meeting her gaze head-on. She noticed, naturally, and her sunglasses reflected the sunlight in sharp, mirrored flashes. For a moment, there was a silent standoff, a clash of wills so intense it felt as though time had slowed. I imagined the headlines residents would whisper among themselves later. The Navy returns to Harbor Point. The mental image of her reaction, arms crossed, lips pursed, and face taut with disbelief, gave me a subtle surge of satisfaction. And in that suspended moment, I understood the full extent of what I was dealing with. Karen Whitmore was more than an HOA president. She was a symbol of the delicate, fragile control humans cling to when rules become personal weapons. Her power over the harbor was built on fear, compliance, and the careful cultivation of her image. She had never faced someone who refused to see her authority as absolute. I, however, had spent months in a world where authority was earned, structured, and accountable, and I was determined that this vessel, my patrol boat, and my return to the harbor would not bow to the arbitrary whims of someone who thought a clipboard could dictate law. The residents continued to whisper, some drawing closer to balconies, others standing at the edge of their porches, phones raised discreetly to capture what was unfolding. I could hear the soft clinking of coffee mugs, the shuffling of slippers on wooden floors, the faint creak of a rocking chair abandoned mid-motion. All of it was a testament to her influence, yet also a reminder that influence could be challenged, and that the myth of invincibility could be punctured by reality. My eyes met Karen, again, unwavering, and in that silent exchange, a message passed. She may have ruled this harbor in perception, but I was not here to negotiate perception. I was here to reclaim the space that belonged to law, to service, and to duty, and if anyone had doubts about the outcome, They were welcome to watch from their balconies as history quietly began to bend. And so the stage was set. Corinne Whitmore, self-appointed sovereign of Harbor Point, patrolling her marina like a queen armed with a clipboard, and me, a Navy veteran newly returned from deployment, standing firmly in the space she had never expected to contest. Residents whispered, some in awe, some in fear, all eager for the next move, as the morning sun continued to climb, reflecting off the calm waters with ironic serenity. The battle lines had been drawn, not with armies, not with guns, but with authority, pride, and the indomitable will of two very different women. And in the quiet, tense anticipation of the harbor, I felt something rare and exhilarating, the unmistakable thrill of being the first to challenge a legend. I tried, in what I hoped was a calm and reasonable tone, to explain the situation, though the absurdity of the moment made it harder to maintain composure than I expected. "This is federal property," I said, gesturing at the sleek, gray hull of my Navy patrol boat that bobbed gently in the morning tide, the sun glinting off the polished metal surfaces as though mocking the absurdity of the confrontation. "The boat is registered under the United States Navy. Your HOA can't ticket it." My words were deliberate, measured, chosen not just to convey truth, but to appeal to logic, the same clarity of thought that had kept me alive through deployments, midnight drills, and hostile waters. But as I watched her reaction, or rather the lack of it, I realized immediately that logic and facts were invisible to Corinne Whitmore in her self-declared kingdom. She smirked at me, that infuriating, confident tilt of the mouth that spoke of 100 previous victories over unsuspecting residents, and the unquestioned enforcement of her imaginary rules. The pink blazer, oversized sunglasses, and clipboard gave her the aura of invincibility, and yet it was impossible to ignore the ridiculousness of it all. The way she strutted on the dock, as if she were a general inspecting a battlefield, taking pictures of my patrol boat like it was some kind of criminal contraband, each click of her camera punctuating the morning air with a sense of triumph that was utterly unearned. "I can ticket whatever is on MY Harbor," she declared, voice dripping with certainty, authority, and just a hint of personal satisfaction, as though she had discovered a loophole in reality itself. Her words hit harder than expected, not because of their substance, which was negligible, but because of the audacity behind them, the sheer confidence with which she wielded imagined power. I sighed, a long exhale that carried the weight of months at sea, months of discipline, and a quiet understanding that some battles are won not with force but with procedure. It was time to make a call, time to bring in the people who understood rules, law, and the limits of HOA authority, and who could translate the absurdity of this confrontation into action without the need for emotional entanglement. My hand went to my pocket, pulling out my phone as Corinne continued her theatrical patrol, snapping pictures with all the seriousness of a crime scene photographer documenting a heist. Her camera lens caught every angle, every detail, and I couldn't help but think that if there were an award for overconfidence paired with misapplied authority, she would win it hands down. I dialed the port authority, fingers moving quickly over the screen, each beep a reminder that this situation, ridiculous as it was, needed immediate intervention. The voice on the other end was familiar, warm with recognition, tinged with humor. They knew me well not just by name but by reputation, by the rhythm of calls, reports, and updates that marked my time in and out of service. When I explained the scenario, the words tumbled out in rapid succession, a mix of disbelief, explanation, and a hint of dry humor. An HOA president slapped a $500 violation sticker on federal military hardware, I said, tone pitched just above incredulity, letting them picture the absurdity of the moment, hopping to convey that while I was annoyed, I was also trying very hard not to laugh at the situation. There was a pause on the other end, a sound that suggested processing, then the unmistakable burst of laughter, the kind that comes from people who know the world is sometimes stranger than fiction. They didn't question the validity of my claim or the audacity of Karen's actions. They laughed, letting the absurdity hang in the air for a moment before the professional response kicked in. "We'll send someone right over," they said, still chuckling, the mixture of amusement and protocol making it clear that they were treating this as both an urgent matter and an opportunity to witness a rare slice of comedic chaos. Meanwhile, Karen remained oblivious to the call being made. She strutted along the dock, her posture rigid, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun in sharp mirrored flashes, clipboard tucked securely under her arm like a weapon. Every few steps, she paused to snap another picture, apparently convinced that each photograph was further proof of her dominion over the harbor, her commitment to evidence gathering. As if the images themselves could magically enforce rules that had no legal basis over federal property. I watched her move, the rhythm of her steps synchronized with the clicks of her camera, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined the dock as a stage, Karen as the unwitting comic heroine of her own self-created drama, and me as the reluctant, steadying force representing law, reason, and protocol. Residents peeked from balconies and porches. Curiosity peaked, whispering to one another about the scene unfolding below, eyes darting between the boat and the woman in pink, some trying to suppress laughter, others shaking their heads in quiet exasperation at the spectacle. I remained calm, though inside I was calculating, analyzing every possible reaction, every escalation that could arise before the Port Authority arrived. My military training, honed over years of deployments and high-stakes missions, kicked in with subtle efficiency. Assess, contain, document, and wait for backup. The absurdity of Karen's behavior did not alter the fundamentals of procedure. It simply added a layer of irritation and incredulity. I began to take my own mental notes, recording the exact sequence of events, her words, her gestures, and the way she seemed to interpret authority through sheer confidence rather than legal precedent. Each step she took, each picture she snapped was cataloged not for personal satisfaction, but for the assurance that when federal enforcement arrived, nothing would be left to interpretation. The dock itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, the usual morning bustle quieted by the tension between civilian audacity and official presence. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries cutting through the rhythm of camera clicks and whispered speculation. The water lapped gently against the hull of the patrol boat, a calming contrast to the chaos on the dock. Even the sunlight seemed sharper, reflecting off polished surfaces with a clarity that made the scene almost cinematic, each ray highlighting the absurd drama unfolding before me. I glanced at the residents again. Couples leaning over railings, binoculars in hand, children clinging to parents' sides, all witnessing a moment that would be whispered about for weeks to come, a story of confrontation between the unyielding confidence of an HOA president and the calm, unshakable authority of federal service. Minutes stretched, though they felt like hours, as I waited for the promised intervention. Karen continued her ritual, moving deliberately, photographing angles of the hull, occasionally muttering to herself, perhaps imagining that these images would fortify her claim or serve as evidence in some imagined tribunal. Her energy was relentless, a mix of vanity and misunderstanding, but it was also predictable, and predictability is a tool in itself. I remained composed, maintaining eye contact when necessary, allowing her to perform while subtly asserting presence and authority without direct confrontation. Each click of her camera was met with my silent calculation. Which angle would be easiest to present to enforcement? How to document her actions without escalation? And how to ensure that this situation, ridiculous as it was, would be resolved efficiently and correctly? Finally, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle reached my ears, faint at first, growing steadily louder, and I knew the Port Authority was on its way. Relief washed over me, tempered by the knowledge that this was far from over. Karen, oblivious to the approaching backup, continued her self-important ritual, yet there was a subtle shift, a slight tightening in her posture that suggested even she might sense the tide turning. Residents craned their necks, whispering excitedly, sensing the culmination of this absurd standoff, the moment when law and procedure would meet self-appointed authority head-on. I allowed myself a small, private smile, knowing that the sticker, the smirk, and the photo session would soon meet the reality of federal oversight, and that the morning's chaos would soon be corrected with efficiency, professionalism, and perhaps just a hint of irony. The morning tension hung thick over Harbor Point Marina like a humid, salty fog, each ripple of the tide reflecting the absurdity of the standoff below. My eyes scanned the dock, still wary, when the unmistakable sound of approaching tires on wooden planks announced the arrival of reinforcements. 2 Port Authority vehicles glided onto the marina in synchronized precision, engines purring like well-trained animals, uniforms crisp and immaculate, badges catching sunlight in gleaming flashes. It was a contrast that could not have been more perfect against the chaotic backdrop of Karen Whitmore's self-imposed jurisdiction. The officers stepped out with the effortless authority of professionals who had seen far too many disputes over docking lines, boat registrations, and territorial claims to be rattled by the overconfidence of one HOA president in pink. Their movements were methodical, calm, a sharp counterpoint to Karen's theatrical energy. Karen noticed immediately. Her posture stiffened, heels digging slightly into the wooden dock, and she straightened her back with the practiced rigidity of someone who had finally found an audience for her theatrics. Her clipboard, always the tool of her imagined dominion, was now held like a shield against the reality she was about to face. She marched toward the officers, each step measured, deliberate, as if she were stepping onto a stage and the entire marina were her audience. "Good. You can tow this illegal commercial vehicle," she announced triumphantly, her voice echoing over the water like a bell tolling for imaginary justice. Her oversized sunglasses reflected the morning sun in harsh flashes, obscuring the slight flicker of doubt that even she couldn't completely hide. Residents leaned further over balconies, murmuring among themselves, some holding phones high, eager to capture what promised to be a rare clash between HOA arrogance and federal authority. One officer, tall and composed, raised a single eyebrow, the gesture speaking volumes more than words could. "Ma'am," he began slowly, deliberately, with a calm authority that seemed to physically ripple through the dock, "this is a Navy patrol vessel." The words were simple, factual, yet they carried the weight of laws, regulations, and centuries of maritime protocol. Karen paused, processing the statement with a fraction of a second too long, and her jaw tightened. She crossed her arms tighter than ever, as if to shield herself from the reality of the situation, and her voice came out with the confidence of a general issuing orders on a battlefield that existed only in her imagination. "And rules are rules," she declared, each word clipped, sharp, a feeble attempt to assert dominion over a domain she had clearly never truly understood. Her smirk faltered slightly, but the stubbornness remained, a hallmark of her character, and she tilted her head as though challenging the officer to question her authority. The officer sighed, a measured exhale that seemed to carry the accumulated patience of countless confrontations with people who confuse self-assurance with legal power. From his uniform pocket, he produced a clipboard of his own, moving with the efficiency and precision that comes from training and experience. The sound of the paper shifting was faint but somehow final, a harbinger that Karen's reign of imagined authority was about to meet reality. He stepped closer, carefully positioning himself so that the sunlight glinted off his badge, catching Karen's attention fully and forcing a tiny, involuntary shift in her stance. "For interfering with federal property and unauthorized tampering," he said, voice calm but firm, "you are being reported." He slid the notice across the dock toward her like a bridge between her fantasy and the rules of the real world. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with undeniable truth. Karen's jaw dropped, her sunglasses catching the sunlight at just the wrong angle, reflecting shards of brilliance back into the dock, as if the universe itself had punctuated the moment with irony. The collective gasp of the spectators was audible, a low ripple of astonishment passing through residents who had spent months fearing her judgment and now witnessed the ultimate inversion of authority. Her carefully constructed posture wavered, a brief tremor betraying the internal calculation racing through her mind. Each heartbeat must have felt deafening to her, the stark contrast between the confidence she wielded and the reality presented by federal officers crystallizing into a sudden, sharp awareness of her limitations. I watched silently, hands still on the rail of my patrol boat, resisting the urge to intervene further, knowing that this was a moment that required no input from me. The authorities had arrived, and the law spoke louder than ego. The second officer, slightly shorter but equally composed, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the dock with the practiced vigilance of someone who understood both human behavior and maritime regulations. He noted the reactions of the gathered residents, the meticulous posture of Corinne Whitmore, and the perfectly positioned patrol boat that symbolized months of discipline, service, and authority. "Ma'am," he added gently but firmly, "you may not interfere with federal property. Any further actions could result in additional citations or legal repercussions." His words were deliberate, professional, and unambiguous. Corinne, who had spent weeks cultivating an aura of invincibility among the residents, faltered visibly, her arms dropping slightly as she struggled to reconcile the reality in front of her with the myth she had perpetuated for so long. The clipboard, once a tool of dominion, now felt almost comically inadequate, a symbol of authority unmoored from law. Residents leaned further forward, binoculars shaking slightly in hands now clammy with excitement or disbelief. Smartphones rose in unison, flashes capturing a tableau of vindication that would circulate through the community, whispered from porch to porch for months to come. Corinne's face shifted through the stages of disbelief, indignation, and finally something resembling stunned silence. Her lips parted as if to protest, to argue, to reclaim some fragment of imagined control, but no words came. The officers, confident and unyielding, allowed her silence to resonate, a silent assertion that authority rooted in law cannot be countered by personal conviction or ego alone. The dock itself seemed to exhale with the collective understanding that power had been measured, weighed, and corrected, the balance restored with the quiet precision of trained officials performing their duty. The taller officer produced a pen from his pocket, filling out the remainder of the report as Corinne's gaze darted around helplessly, the realization sinking in that the kingdom she had ruled in perception was, in reality, subject to rules far beyond her reach. The shorter officer scanned the surrounding area, noting the reactions of neighbors and the subtle movements of the boat, ensuring that all actions remained compliant with regulations and free from any threat to safety. Corinne, for the first time visibly shaken, adjusted her sunglasses in a futile attempt to mask her embarrassment, the smirk replaced by a faint frown as the weight of accountability pressed upon her. Her earlier confidence, once so immovable, now seemed almost fragile, like a paper structure bending under the force of undeniable truth. I remained still, observing, the morning sun glinting off the water and the patrol boat, reflecting the serenity of discipline and order against the chaotic theater that Corinne had attempted to stage. The Port Authority officers moved with calm efficiency, their presence alone dissolving the tension that had gripped the dock for hours. Every click of the pen, every shuffle of paper, every calm instruction served as a silent reminder. Authority exists not through arrogance, self-assigned titles, or performance, but through law, training, and the unwavering application of both. Corinne Whitmore, self-declared sovereign of Harbor Point, had encountered a reality she could not command, and the collective hush of residents, broken only by whispered astonishment, underscored the magnitude of the moment. Finally, the officers stepped back, the report complete, the notice handed over, and the patrol boat, fully compliant and unthreatened, remained firmly in its rightful place. Corinne stood frozen, jaw still slack, sunglasses unable to hide the shock, clipboard now almost comically small in her grasp, as if it had betrayed her along with her authority. Around the dock, Residents began to murmur, some in triumph, some in disbelief, all witnessing the culmination of a rare event, the correction of overconfidence with professionalism and law. The tide lapped gently against the hull of the patrol boat, a rhythmic counterpoint to the silent drama that had just played out, as if the harbor itself acknowledged that order had been restored. The morning sun reflected off polished metal, badges, and the watcher alike, a cinematic reminder that authority, when grounded in reality and law, prevails over arrogance, imagination, and ego, no matter how loudly they parade themselves across a dock. The morning sun hung high over Harbor Point Marina, casting a crystalline shimmer across the water and illuminating every detail of the unfolding confrontation with unforgiving clarity. Karen Whitmore, once a figure of absolute confidence and unquestioned authority, now stood rigid on the dock, her pink blazer crisp yet somehow mismatched against the moment, oversized sunglasses unable to shield the flicker of uncertainty that began to seep through her carefully constructed facade. The Port Authority officers, calm and unyielding, moved with the measured grace of professionals who had seen countless disputes, yet few so theatrically absurd as this. Every gesture, every word, every step was deliberate, underscored by the weight of law and the unshakable authority of federal jurisdiction. Karen had prided herself on controlling the marina with an invisible fist, commanding fear and obedience through reputation alone. But now that illusion was unraveling in real time, every taut line of confidence slackening under the pressure of undeniable truth. As the officers began to explain the seriousness of her actions, their voices clear, deliberate, and free from any hint of condescension, Karen's smirk faltered. Words like unauthorized interference, federal property, and legal consequences reverberated across the dock, each syllable hammering against her self-perception, dismantling the fortress of ego she had spent months building. Her arms, once crossed with the certainty of a ruler surveying her kingdom, began to drop, hands flexing nervously at her sides as if the invisible weight of accountability had physically manifested. The residents, who had been silently watching from balconies, porches, and even behind partially drawn curtains, leaned further forward, phones raised, cameras at the ready. Their whispered speculations had transformed into a collective, captivated audience bearing witness to the unraveling of a figure they had once feared. The tension was palpable, hanging in the salty morning air like a tangible entity, every glance, every shutter click capturing the slow, inexorable collapse of Karen Whitmore's self-imposed dominion. "You may not interfere with federal property," one officer explained patiently, his tone firm but not cruel, a professional clarity that made every word resonate like law itself personified. "The United States Navy maintains jurisdiction over this vessel, and any further actions on your part could result in citations or legal consequences." He emphasized jurisdiction, as if speaking to someone who had confused imagination with authority, letting the weight of the term sink into the dock like an anchor dragging behind a ship. Karen's posture shifted subtly, the rigid lines of control beginning to bow, her chin dipping slightly as the implications of her actions finally registered. The clipboard in her hand, once wielded like a scepter, now seemed almost laughably inadequate, a fragile prop in the theater of a crumbling self-image. Residents leaned further over railings, some mouths agape, some clapping softly in disbelief, capturing every nuance for future storytelling. Karen's first attempt at defense came quickly, almost reflexively, as though she believed sheer volume and indignation could summon compliance. "You can't do this. I run this harbor," she exclaimed, her voice carrying across the dock with an urgency that bordered on panic. The words were sharp, desperate, a final grasp at control slipping through her fingers. Her oversized sunglasses reflected the sun in blinding flashes, but they could not hide the tremor in her voice, the slight quiver in her posture, the subtle signs of a facade cracking under the weight of reality. Residents murmured among themselves, astonished, some chuckling quietly, others simply observing, phones raised to record the spectacle that had become the morning's centerpiece. The theater of her authority, performed for so long with such unwavering confidence, was now a fragile illusion exposed to scrutiny, and the audience could not look away. The taller Port Authority officer met her gaze evenly, his own posture firm, unyielding, yet devoid of hostility. He shook his head slowly, the simplicity of the gesture carrying profound authority. "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice calm but resonant, echoing the gravity of the law over the desperation of ego. "The United States Navy does." The words landed with the finality of a gavel striking a bench, simple yet impossible to counter. Karen froze mid-step, her mouth slightly open, hands gripping the clipboard as though trying to hold herself together through sheer force. The truth, so clear and immutable, settled over her like a tide she could not resist, washing away the constructs of personal power she had relied upon for so long. For the first time, the certainty she had built, her imagined dominion, the fear she commanded, the invisible crown she wore atop her persona, no longer held. The reality of federal authority, of laws and regulations that far outweighed HOA rules, had pierced the bubble of control she had cultivated. Silence fell over the dock, a heavy, expectant hush that seemed to absorb the sound of seagulls crying overhead and water lapping gently against the patrol boat. The residents, previously murmuring and whispering in anticipation, held their collective breath, witnessing a moment that would undoubtedly be recounted for weeks, perhaps years, as the day Karen Whitmore's unchallenged reign over Harbor Point Marina had been definitively confronted by the immovable presence of law and authority. Phones continued to click softly, some capturing video, some photographs, all documenting the slow, inevitable collapse of ego before facts, regulations, and reality. The officers, patient and composed, allowed the silence to stretch, knowing that words were no longer necessary. The message had been delivered. Karen's body language spoke volumes, each subtle shift revealing the unraveling of her confidence, the realization that her authority was both limited and temporary, and that the world did not bend to the whims of oversized sunglasses and pink blazers. She went silent, truly silent, the first time in anyone's memory that she had failed to produce a word, an argument, a protest. Even her eyes, obscured behind reflective lenses, seemed to flicker with the dawning comprehension of defeat, the recognition that the power she had wielded over neighbors, docks, and decoration standards was utterly insignificant when measured against federal law. The clipboard sagged slightly in her hands, no longer a weapon or tool of command, but a meaningless accessory in the shadow of jurisdiction she could not claim. Her lips parted once, as if to form a word, then closed again, powerless to articulate anything that could alter the inevitable outcome. The officers stood steady, professional. The Navy patrol boat glinting behind them like a sentinel of authority, a reminder of service, duty, and the tangible reality of the chain of command. Residents exhaled collectively, a subtle wave of energy passing through balconies and porches, as though the air itself recognized that a shift had occurred. Phones lowered, whispers began anew, this time tinged with awe and relief rather than fear. Karen Whitmore, self-declared Queen of Harbor Point, had been humbled by a force she could neither control nor comprehend fully. For the first time ever, she was confronted not with neighbors' compliance, not with whispered obedience, but with unyielding, factual authority, and she had no rebuttal, no avenue of resistance, and no script for what came next. The morning sun reflected off the water and the patrol boat, off the officers' badges, and even off Karen's sunglasses, creating a tableau of contrast between arrogance and law, imagination and reality, ego and duty. I stood on the dock, coffee forgotten, bag at my side, watching the final pieces of the confrontation settle into place. The officers had explained, documented, and enforced the boundary that Karen had ignored, and in the process, a lesson in accountability had unfolded in front of an audience who had long lived under her unchallenged rule. Karen's silence was not just the absence of words. It was the embodiment of realization, the physical manifestation of truth overpowering bravado. The patrol boat, once threatened by a sticker and a misunderstanding, floated securely in the water, a testament to procedure, authority, and the discipline of service. The dock, the marina, and even the residents seemed to recognize that something fundamental had shifted. The myth of Karen Whitmore's invincibility had been punctured, replaced with the unmistakable clarity of law, logic, and fact. And in that rare, suspended moment, the dock held its breath as Karen stood still, silent, and unmoored, a figure for the first time in memory stripped of pretense, confronted by truth, and left with nothing to say. It was a silence that resonated louder than any proclamation, a silence filled with the weight of accountability, the inevitability of law, and the quiet triumph of reality over ego. The marina continued around her, gulls cried, water lapped, and residents whispered. But for Karen Whitmore, the world had contracted to a single, undeniable fact. Authority, when grounded in law and reason, could not be challenged by mere confidence or imagination, and for the first time ever, she had nowhere to stand. The harbor had returned to a deceptive calm, a serene illusion that masked the ripple effect of the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. The sun had climbed higher, glinting off the water and bouncing off the hull of my patrol boat, which now sat peacefully at its dock, free of the bright, absurd $500 violation sticker that had so audaciously attempted to mark federal property, as if community rules could override law. There was a subtle sense of victory in the air, a collective sigh from the marina and surrounding residences, as if the very wood of the docks themselves exhaled relief. Word had spread quickly. The HOA had been forced to remove the sticker and issue a formal written apology to the United States Navy, a gesture both procedural and symbolic, cementing the understanding that federal property is not subject to personal interpretation, no matter how confident the interpreter might be. Residents whispered about the incident in hushed tones and behind closed doors, some still marveling at the sheer audacity of Karen Whitmore's actions, others sharing wry smiles at the poetic justice delivered by law and authority. Karen herself had vanished from immediate sight. The rumors swirled like autumn leaves caught in a sudden gust, carried on conversations at balconies, through mailroom chatter, and over the crackling voices of neighbors who could not resist recounting the events with a mix of awe and relief. "She resigned," one resident whispered, a note of incredulity in their tone. "Temporarily," Karen had claimed, attempting to soften the blow to her reputation, yet the smirk that accompanied her announcement betrayed the truth. No one believed her. The resignation was final in the eyes of Harbor Point, an unspoken acknowledgement that confidence without substance crumbles quickly under the weight of reality. Her pink blazer, oversized sunglasses, and clipboard, once symbols of her imagined dominion, would no longer march the docks, snap photos, or inspire fearful whispers among residents who had, for far too long, tiptoed around her self-declared authority. There was a subtle liberation in the air, a collective realization that the invisible chains of petty control had been broken, replaced by a renewed sense of order rooted in law, reason, and reality, rather than ego and imagination. Residents, once tentative and wary of approaching the docks, began greeting me with smiles, friendly nods, and the occasional plate of cookies. A humorous but sincere gesture of gratitude that made the absurdity of the past days feel almost surreal. I found myself waved at from porches, receiving polite thumbs-ups from neighbors as I passed along the boardwalk, and even a few tentative invitations for casual coffee or morning greetings that had been previously non-existent under Karen's reign of intimidation. The sense of camaraderie and light-hearted relief was almost tangible, a stark contrast to the tense mornings spent navigating the silent judgments of windows and balconies. It was a small, human celebration of justice meted out in an unexpected yet thoroughly satisfying way. The cookies were delicious, of course, a minor but genuine reminder that sometimes victories are measured not just in formalities, but in warm, chocolate chip-smudged smiles of neighbors who had finally breathed freely. My patrol boat, the steadfast vessel that had borne witness to deployments, long nights at sea, and the absurdity of HOA overreach, now glistened proudly under the sun, hull reflecting the light in a way that made the incident feel almost ceremonial in retrospect. The absence of the sticker, the smooth, unmarred surface of the bow, and the polished metal fitting served as a visual confirmation of reality restored, a tangible reminder that law and service hold weight even when ego and imagination attempt to interfere. I found myself running a hand along the railing more than once, a small, private gesture of appreciation for the vessel that had not only carried me through literal storms, but now had weathered the storm of human absurdity with grace and authority. Every time I walked past it, I felt a surge of amusement, recalling the audacious smirk, the obsessive documentation, and the unshakable, if misplaced, confidence of Corinne Whitmore. Even as the marina returned to normal activity, the echoes of her defeat lingered in subtle ways. Conversations at docks carried undertones of the incident. A kayak gently nudging a pier might be met with a knowing glance. A lawn chair was aligned with an extra precision in quiet homage to the humor of the past events, and children whispered among themselves, reenacting the confrontation with toy boats and makeshift clipboards. The narrative of Corinne's brief, spectacularly misguided assertion of power had entered the collective memory of Harbor Point, a cautionary tale, a source of entertainment, and a subtle lesson on the limits of confidence when it lacks grounding in fact. It was as if the entire community had collectively exhaled, relieved that order had been reaffirmed, and that petty authoritarianism had been tempered by law, reason, and a Navy patrol boat that refused to be diminished by a sticker. And then there was Corinne's confidence, the thing that had loomed over the marina for so long, palpable even from a distance. It had been mighty, insistent, and seemingly immovable, radiating from her in waves that had influenced behavior, dictated decorum, and instilled caution and fear in her neighbors. Yet all it took was reality, applied calmly, firmly, and with authority, to deflate it entirely. I couldn't help but laugh quietly every time I recalled her posture, the slow comprehension of her error, and the stunned silence that replaced the performative dominance she had wielded with such gusto. It was a laugh that carried relief, amusement, and a touch of vindication, a subtle acknowledgement that sometimes the world corrects itself in small but spectacularly satisfying ways. The absurdity of ego meeting law, arrogance meeting consequence, had played out so perfectly that it felt almost cinematic, a tableau of humility, authority, and human imperfection captured in the quiet, shimmering light of the harbor. Even the marina seemed to participate in the humor of the moment, the gentle lap of water against pilings echoing like soft applause, gulls circling overhead with indifferent grace, and sunlight glinting off railings, ropes, and the patrol boat's polished surfaces, as if nature itself approved of the outcome. The residents continued their small celebrations, subtle acknowledgments of regained autonomy and reassurance that the docks were no longer ruled by fear and overconfidence. It was a collective exhale, a return to balance, where law, reason, and the quiet dignity of service outweighed self-assigned dominion. The atmosphere was light, buoyed by relief, and the shared recognition that the absurdity of the past days had been resolved with clarity, fairness, and just a hint of humor. And so, as I walked past my patrol boat on sunny mornings, as I moved along the docks with coffee in hand or gear slung over my shoulder, I couldn't help but laugh again and again. Not at her personally, but at the sheer spectacle, the audacity of her confidence, and the finality with which reality had intervened. The boat sat there, proud, unmarred, a tangible symbol of authority, resilience, and service, while the memory of Corinne Whitmore's misguided assertion remained a lesson to all who might confuse ego for power. The only thing more powerful than a Navy patrol boat, I realized with quiet amusement, had been Corinne's confidence, until reality struck with the quiet, undeniable force of law, logic, and undeniable truth. And in that laughter, mingled with sunlight, salt air, and the gentle lapping of the harbor, I found not just amusement but the comforting knowledge that order, respect, and reality could prevail, even when confronted with the most colorful, determined, and thoroughly misguided displays of self-assured authority. Weeks later, the harbor was calm again. No surprise inspections. No measuring tape. No pink blazer stalking the docks. Sometimes new residents would ask, "What happened to the old HOA president?" And the locals would grin. "She tried to ticket the Navy." That was all the explanation they needed.